Good afternoon, everyone. Just going to give everyone a couple of seconds to sort of filter in here, and then we'll get started for today. Alrighty, I see that number jumping up, so let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the live webinar, Maximizing HR ROI, Unveiling Research from 1,000 plus HR Leaders. I'm Alex Ruetsky, Digital Media Coordinator for Annex Business Media, as well as your moderator for this session. Before we get started here, I just want to extend a big thank you to our sponsor, WorkTango, for putting on this webinar. Before I pass it over to our speaker this morning, I'd just like to take a moment to go over a few housekeeping items. Firstly, this webinar is being recorded, so if for any reason you have to leave early or you miss part of the presentation, a link to the recording will be emailed to all registrants shortly. Secondly, the audience is in listen-only mode, so cameras and microphones will be turned off for you. However, questions can and should be submitted to the Q&A folder at the bottom right of your screen, and all questions will be saved for the end of today's presentation. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, Rob Catalano. Rob has spent the last 20 years building HR technology and advisory companies with the lens of a business leader, but more importantly, as a people leader. Rob was on the founding team at Achievers, where he spent 10 plus years growing the organization, and his passion for improving the employee experience led him to co-founding WorkTango in 2015. Without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Rob for his presentation.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Pleasure to be here. I appreciate it, Alex and the team, for putting these on, and all of you. Thank you for taking time out of busy schedules to come up for air and hear what else is out there. This is a topic I am very passionate about, employee experience technology, and the ROI that comes from it. But before I get into any formal introduction, I'd love to see where everyone's in from today on the chat. Want this to be interactive, definitely use the Q&A. We'll get to questions at the end. But I'm actually in from Toronto. I'm surprised I have a voice after the Leaf game last night. I don't really want to talk about it, but again, really excited you're all here. We got some Sherwood Park. Awesome. Thanks, Patrick. Calgary. Wonderful. So no other Leaf fans. You guys are still, remiss after last night and sad at the results. But that being said, before I get into any introduction, I want to start off with a bit of a story. And that story starts with this image and picture. Now, this is a picture of DuPont Company Executive Committee in 1919. I think workplaces have changed a bit. I saw London. I don't know if that's London, Ontario or London, UK. I have lived in London, UK, but welcome, Kelly. So DuPont Company Executive Committee in 1919. And a man named Donaldson Brown, he's actually standing in the light-colored suit, second from the right. That gentleman authored a report on the performance and accomplishments of all the different DuPont departments that deeply impressed their president. And he did all this research, and what happened, he basically developed a formula for monitoring business performance, right? Combine earnings, working capital, investments, all into a single measure that he termed return on investment, right? And now we call it that in all the academic circles, the financial circles. It used to be called the DuPont model. A lot of people call it return on investment or ROI today. And the DuPont company themselves quickly made ROI their primary performance measure, right, for all their departments. And we're thinking about this, over 100 years later, we're still talking about ROI today, right? And actually likely now more than ever with a lot that's happening in the economy and the way we're running our businesses. But thinking about the 1900s, this picture, gets me pretty nostalgic, and this is an HR discussion. So it got me thinking, what else has been around since the 1900s? And a couple of things that you're all really familiar with. The employee engagement survey actually started in World War I, right? Companies, again, are still using that today. The middle picture, Henry Ford back in 1907 had an attrition rate of over 700% and realized, how am I going to get people to sit on the front lines and build those cars? And he created the first, effectively, years of service program and recognition program. If people sat in seat, they got a reward. People still do that today. Performance management actually started in the 1900s, but it was more popularized in the 60s by GE. Many companies still do that today. But there's a big reason why ROI stands the test of time versus how the other three have evolved. And that big change is inputs and outputs, right? ROI is the output we want, right? It's the outcome of all of our efforts. The outcome doesn't really change, right? We always want to focus on what's the benefit from our actions, what's the benefit from our investments. But the difference is things like employee listening, I just mentioned, or recognition or performance management. Even though conceptually they're the same, it's not a formulaic outcome like ROI. It requires inputs that need to change as the modern workplace changes. What worked in the past in those solutions isn't going to work today. And in order to realize ROI on these efforts, right, we can't do the same things we were doing 100 years ago in those worlds. We want to find impact and build a better employee experience. And a lot of companies are navigating through that today. All the things I just mentioned, some organizations are still doing those things from 100 years ago as a predominant way to listen to their employees or recognize them or manage performance, right? And companies are changing those inputs to get the ROI they want. So based on that story and a little bit of history there, I wanted to talk about today a couple of specific things. One, are employee experience investments critical in the first place? Then we'll dive into what ROI should be expected from those types of investments. Then I want to shift gears to talk about what do high ROI companies do differently versus non-ROI companies when it comes to HR investments. And then I want to get a little more prescriptive, right? Best practices for unlocking the ROI narrative, the approach, and a little more of the how-to versus here's a bunch of information and research we provided. So that being said, just by introduction again, I've spent the last 20 years building HR technology companies. I've been a CEO, a head of people, all the things you can think of. My goal is to bring the wisdom of crowds of all that effort and work and to share what I've learned, not only from the research I'm going to share, but also from my experience working with my own organizations and hundreds of companies out there across the world. But the reason why I'm also so passionate about this topic is based on my background. So quick little story, I actually graduated in early 2000s, so over 22 or so years ago with a marketing degree. In my marketing degree, I went into the workforce, I spent time at large organizations, I looked around realizing, wow, first off, employees aren't that happy at work. Like that's what I was going to do for the next 40 years was not be happy at my job place where I'm going to spend most of my waking time. But I also realized everything I learned in marketing, like consumer behavior, I'm like, yeah, that's great and interesting of why someone would tie themselves to a brand. I was more interested in why do employees tie themselves to a company? But more so, when it comes to marketing, you are spending a lot of money and resources, right? And companies need to know what's the ROI on that investment. And as I'm also looking around, I was like, you know what? That people line in the budget is way higher than our marketing budget. Why aren't we measuring that? Why don't we have ROI on our employees? Why aren't we using the same concepts that I learned from a marketing level into the employee space? And I quickly changed careers. So that's history, 20 years of being in this space, but it really started with that mindset, which is why I'm so passionate about this. I'm also a huge sports fan, as I mentioned, as a Leaf fan. You'll probably see that infused into all of my talk. So hopefully you don't mind that as well. I saw some people here as well, not too far in Ontario. So where I want to start, as I mentioned in that goal, is I want to start, what are the, we asked folks from research, what are the first, or are there employee experience investments critical? And I always like to ask another way, why should we care? And like, what does the data say at the end of the day? And I want to start in terms of why we should care before I get into the research. But here's one reason why we should care. I could spend all day with all the data and the research, but pretty simple, right? Fortune's 100 best companies to work for, they beat the market by a factor of 3.3, half the turnover of their peers, 6 times more likely to recommend their employees or when they hear from their employees. Outperform the stock market by 2 or 3. So when you think of ROI and employee experience investment, there's a lot of research that's out there, and this is just one of many. Now, another reason we should care is this. Now, we don't hear as much anymore, but after the pandemic, it was all about the great resignation, quiet kid quitting, productivity paranoia, all these things. And the point I wanted to make about this is that this isn't just going to end. Like, we're not going to wait and ride out this concept of productivity paranoia or employees not being happy. And I wanted to share some data to prove that. There's some interesting research by HBR showed that data on total employment for the last decade reveals that the great resignation is not a pandemic-driven anomaly. And what you're seeing on the data here is what is the share of workers that are voluntarily leaving their jobs year over year? And other than that one weird COVID year where the data, made a switch, it's going up every single year. And why is it happening? Because we're not focused on creating great employee experiences for our workforce. We're not investing in the technology. And some people aren't seeing that ROI, right? So to dig into this further, right, to understand why and how ROI plays into these investments, again, to build that better employee experience, and we know the impact of experience I just shared, what I did is I commissioned research with a fantastic partner and an analyst firm called Lighthouse Research and Advisory. And we asked 1,000 global HR leaders just a couple of months ago, what they thought about their investments, ROI they were seeing, right? And again, these 1,000 leaders and these responses I want to share with you. Now, these are responses across the board, companies that are 100 employees all the way up to 10,000 employees, all the industries you can think of. Employees were split either in Canada or US or multi-location or national or international. But the intent of the research was to focus on some of the specifics around ROI and the value from investing in employee experience technology, but also to examine what are the practices that set high ROI companies apart from the rest, right? So, I'll kind of bring to life, the whole concept of why employee experience is important, and we'll dive into the rest of the agenda. But the first question to set the table for the discussion today was we asked, in today's economic climate, is focusing on employee engagement still important? I'm curious in the chat, do people think it's still important? Be honest, yes, no? And this is one question we asked, over 1,000 HR leaders responded, and the answer was a resounding yes. Right? According to 90% of the survey respondents, it is critical to focus on employee experience, especially now in an economic downturn. And again, this is companies of all sizes, right? It doesn't matter what size or industry they're in, it's pretty much positive across the board. Now, why is important, right? But what to do about it is what we dove further into. So we dove into, well, what can organizations do to improve the employee experience in and of itself? And we got some interesting, yes, absolutely. Thanks, Helen. So what we got was we asked people, what are the following technologies do your companies use today to help improve employee engagement, help improve the employee experience? Again, I don't need to sell you on why that's all important for driving company success. And we saw some of the things that bubble to the top, right? Performance management, recognition, rewards, and so on. I'll summarize this and make this a little bit easy to absorb, but the top three were around investing in performance management, 67% employee recognition rewards, and 56% in employee surveys and employee listening. But what's particularly interesting to me is that you can do all of this without technology, right? Back 100 years ago, when I mentioned, they were doing this without technology. But companies are seeing the impact and value in investing in that because many do see ROI. A bit of a spoiler alert I'll show later. But I think what's more interesting is employers that revenue grew recently are most likely to be using multiple tools, right? Companies are actually using multiple technologies you saw on the list prior, this one, in order to drive the ROI that they're looking for in these types of investments. Now, that data resonates back to our story, right? About starting 100 years ago, some of these efforts that you see on the screen here. What I thought was particularly interesting is we see a powerful correlation. Employers with a positive ROI from their employee experience technology investments are prioritizing each of these activities on a more frequent basis, right? 100 years ago, we might recognize people for every 5 years sitting in seat, or do an annual appraisal, or do a survey once every 2 years. But technology is now allowing that to become more frequent, allow people to change with the changing in workplace. You saw the picture of what DuPont looked like, right? The organization looks and feels a little bit different. We're not all sitting in the same place either. So what I wanted to do was just kind of set the table. I want to find out from the research, the next major part of our conversation today is, all right, well, are EX investments critical? Yes, but what ROI should be expected from those investments, right? We can agree, right? I think a lot of us would agree that it's critical. Companies should focus on it. So what ROI should be expected? Now, not only do I love this topic, and I told you I love hockey and I love fun facts. So here's one that has nothing to do with HR tech, but in 1914, when ROI was created, the Leafs actually won the Stanley Cup. Can you believe that? I know they've won a few times since then, although it hasn't been since 1967. It's very painful. But as a Leaf fan, these are the things that I lean on to get me through. And if you're a sport fan too, it was actually 1914 when Babe Ruth actually made his MLB debut as a pitcher. So for all you sport fans out there, some interesting 1914 trivia coming at you. So I digress. Back to normal here. What ROI is expected from these investments? So we asked folks, and we asked, well, what does ROI from employee experience look like to you? So what is the expected ROI of investing in employee experience software? And I'm sure a lot of you would likely say the same things. But I think the two results are telling, right? The two at the top. More than half of employees say that they expect employee performance, productivity, retention to increase after investing in EX tech. I think that's a great thing. But what's also interesting, a few other observations, it's great to see non-employee metrics on this too, right? Higher customer satisfaction at the third highest. 37% said cost savings, right? Critical in today's climate. Efficiency is important, right? All the admin time of things we might be doing in the legacy world without technology, new process, right? That's important to people, especially in HR. I mean, we're all being asked to do more with less. But the point I want to make here is when we're thinking about investments, we should understand, well, what's the outcome when we want to make this investment? How can we communicate that? What are those things? We'll talk about that at the end of the webinar. But this all being said, it's not to say that these outcomes are mutually exclusive, right? They don't just happen one of these many things. Right? A good example, I've worked with, again, hundreds of companies around the world and, worked with Arrowhead and a credit union on a recognition initiative and investment. And what did they see? Well, not only some great people metrics, 49% reduction in turnover, but also saving money as well by consolidating spends, right? Even the quote on the side, like time savings and efficiency. And much of the research we saw alluded to the fact that ROI is multi-threaded when people are using multiple tools. So again, I think it's critical to understand that we have to understand what ROI we expect and make sure we're measuring accordingly. So what we dove into further was not only what ROI was expected, but what employee experience software features generate the greatest ROI. Like, think about it. Software can do a lot of things. I look at my phone, I look at my computer. It can do many, many things. Think of any HR technology you've implemented. It can do several things, but what were the characteristics of features that supported a better ROI story? Right. So think about that. We wanted to know what software features generate the greatest ROI. And for what it's worth, I was so excited to see this because I've built HR technology for the last 2 decades. And what the study showed was that there's a lot here, but we have to be able to rank the following items in terms of importance when selecting employee engagement technology. And you're probably not surprised. Reporting analytics, ease of use, cost, integration into systems, right? Future roadmap, innovative features. Interestingly enough, vendor reputation was one of the lowest, but 50% identified that it was still important. And I like this slide because think about where companies' minds are at when they're buying this type of technology. I find this is a really great way for you and your teams to sit down and say, all right, if we're going to assess new software, what matters around the table, right? Is brand reputation more important than ease of use, or a better reporting suite important than cost? So it's a good way to kind of assess when you're making those investments, what that would look and feel like. But it begs the question, what is more critical to driving ROI? And that's what we found out. Companies with positive ROI from the research prioritize three things: reporting, number one; ease of use, number two; and cost was a distant third. Now, what's interesting, if you compare that with neutral ROI companies, it wasn't about ease of use. It wasn't about reporting analytics. That was further down the list. Ease of use and cost bubbled to the top. So from a practical perspective, when HR leaders are picking tech, right, they need to look at things differently, right? 66% of employers said they got a positive ROI from their investments, but it's interesting to see what's driving that ROI as well. I also think it's interesting to see reporting and analytics be a big gap in really driving what's critical from a positive ROI perspective versus not. So food for thought, ask your team what's critical, right? It'll help in your decision making later when you're you're scoring or identifying or weighing different purchases you might want to make. Now, what's interesting, if I bring this to life on a story perspective, I don't have to look further than my own backyard, right? I spent a lot of time building recognition and reward technology the first decade of my career. And 9 years ago, I co-founded WorkTango, right? Started off as an employee listening, employee survey tool. And a lot of people would ask, like, Rob, what are you thinking, right? Like, you can do surveys anywhere for free out there. The Survey Monkeys, the forms. But not only WorkTango, but a whole market was built on the ability to make it easier for people to administer surveys, build confidentiality, look at reporting and analytics, right? Speed up the time to action. So this investment that companies make, are making it to see ROI, right? And that's the way I looked at it. You can spend all the time doing the manual components of pulling reporting or sending it up to leaders or whatever it is. But there's time, there's a cost in that in and of itself in terms of hours and people and that. But again, you could use free items. So sometimes investments make the dollar go further, make your employee experience go further. And a lot of that research showed that in spades. And again, I always love telling stories, and mine is a really good example of that. So to shift gears, right? We started number one, our employee experience investment's critical. Then we just talked about what the ROI should be expected. But what I want to get into now are what are high ROI companies doing differently, right? This is the magic. What are they doing differently than other organizations? But before I do, one more 1914 stat. 1914 was a big year. We got ROI, the Leafs won the cup, Vogue hosted their first model show, right? Look at all these great things that happened in 1914. They changed our world. This has nothing to do with HR ROI, but I thought it was interesting. So I will get back to regular programming. That being said, I'm not seeing a lot of chats. I'm not seeing questions. Feel free to add them in there. Alex is going to come back and ask questions later for me. I'll try to keep an eye on it as well to make this interactive. But again, please do not hesitate. So back to what do high ROI companies do differently? So once you consider employee experience is critical, right? It offers ROI in different capacities. The shift in discussion right now is we looked at all the data and we compared, right? We have high ROI companies versus people that had no ROI, none at all, went negative. And what can we learn from those companies of what we can do differently? So we asked one of the questions, which was, how are organizations actually measuring and categorizing ROI? And first, it was pretty simple. I love this stat. Companies who use data to evaluate engagement or employee experience are 5 times more likely to say they have a positive ROI from employee experience technology investments. Right? Now, again, it's probably not surprising, right? If we're looking at the data lens of what we're seeing from an outcome perspective, we took the DuPont model of saying, well, we're doing all this stuff. Does it actually move the needle in terms of a positive ROI? It was great to see that. And in a similar breath in the same question, we asked, well, what ROI did you see? And this looks a little similar to the last chart I showed, but it's different. It wasn't what they thought would happen. This is the areas employers saw positive ROI. Higher employee productivity, 65%, 58% employee retention. But great, higher customer sat. We're getting outside of the people world, cost savings, and so on, even getting down to Glassdoor ratings, improved stock performance. And these are pretty telling numbers, right? These are a lot of areas that we know drive impact to the business, right? Not just engagement and retention, but how that drives success of your company, or all the things we talked about at the beginning when it came to profitability or stock prices or those types of things. But likely, I think the most telling data from the research is this. What we learned from companies that not only saw positive ROI, but focused on data to measure what their investment was going to bear, there were 3 interesting things. One, it did not take a massive investment. 2/3 of companies that invested less than $10,000 saw benefits of $10,000 to $50,000 in that investment. $10,000 is not a lot of money when you think of what that means from an average headcount perspective, right? In some cases, that could be a quarter to a tenth of someone's time. Now, I don't usually like a lot of words on slides. I'm sure you've noticed that, but there's a lot on the slide to try to get these important ROI points from the research, but that was the first one. Second is ROI ranges. Some companies see moderate ROI, but others see significantly more. And what the research showed is 40 to 50% of companies that, again, saw positive ROI and used data to measure, saw payback on a range similar to what they invested. But 35 to 45% saw outsized positive results, sometimes 2 or 3 even higher of their investment. If you actually look at the math, what it breaks down to is only a small percentage of companies that aren't seeing ROI from these types of investments. And lastly, investment in employee experience scales. 81% of the companies that invested at least 6 figures in their employee engagement programs saw more than 100K in benefit. Right? It makes perfect sense. High ROI companies are more likely to say reporting analytics was a top feature, right? When we're looking at why they choose experience, but it's a mindset of understanding and measuring ROI and using data in these experiences. And again, I see this all the time, right? Like I work with another organization, another credit union. Not only do they see 70% decrease in employee turnover, but huge increases in hitting customer satisfaction scores as well, right? So the idea is that there's a lot of impact that sometimes is hard to see, but that mindset that it does move the needle is where, what a lot of the data is showing. So we also ask people, well, what employee experience technologies, best practices deliver the greatest ROI? And what we noticed was that a vast majority of companies generate a positive ROI from EX investments. 93% said EX software provided a positive or at least neutral ROI. That is a huge number, right? Employers using just employee survey tools, that one example in my story later, 31% more likely to say they have positive ROI. And on the recognition side, 28% are more likely to receive positive ROI. And that's just investment from a technology lens. So again, I could spend all day talking about data, but what I really wanted to double click on today is, well, what are the best practices for unlocking it, right? How can we focus on the right ROI narrative, right? How do we focus on different approaches that work in organizations based on what the research said? So, in about a couple of days, the research we're actually going to publish out. Definitely follow me on LinkedIn or follow WorkTango. You can get that information. But I did want to focus not only on the data we collected and what it said, but more importantly, what can we do about it, right? And again, someone mentioned, thank you, Nancy, for the 1914 interludes. I have one more, and I just did this one because I thought it was exciting and fun, and I'm a huge fan of the song "The Cucaracha." And if you've ever heard it, it's the cockroach song. It's a very popular folk song. It's about a cockroach that can't walk. Everyone probably knows it, but lo and behold, started in 1914. Again, has nothing to do with the topic today, other than it's the same year that ROI is invented. But let's keep going. Let's get to the last part of today's conversation. So what I want to share, 4 best practices for unlocking employee engagement ROI. And again, I want to take the opportunity to get prescriptive, right? I want to complement the data with what I've seen, what my organization has seen, right? But food for thought for the approaches that can work for you. So let's get into the first of the 4 items. The first is, if you aren't measuring ROI of your investments, especially from an employee experience perspective, it is time to start, right? Especially as it's harder to get budget, right? We understand that many industries right now are struggling. Our resources are getting more scarce, and there's a demand to provide this ROI narrative. So I want to discuss different ways you can approach defining ROI on your investments in your own company with a very simple model based on some of the common things I've seen. And that being said, 2 caveats. 1, start with these metrics before you start implementing something, right? It's just making sure there's a baseline for what you have. What I mean by that is, if you're going to measure engagement, for example, once every 3 years and launch a program a year and a half in, you're not going to be able to see the impact of that in a very long time. So you have to have a baseline that you need to start with. And the second is, I'm giving you an example of a typical model companies get to, but don't overwhelm yourself, right? Start with a few that I mentioned today if you're just getting started in this world. And surprisingly, I speak with a lot of HR leaders, a lot of organizations. Some aren't, may not be using technology, but many aren't really thinking about ROI this way, or even tracking the investments and what impact those investments are having. So where I want to take that is, there's 3 pillars of ROI to consider. One is what I call people ROI, one is what I call HR ROI, and one is what I call company ROI. So to double click on these a little more, when we think about the first one, the people ROI, this is probably nothing that surprises you, right? I call it just people ROI. It's all why we're in this profession. But before any investment, and quite honestly, right, you probably are, or if you're not, should be measuring these. Starting with engagement and retention are important output metrics of all the activities you do to build a great employee experience. And again, you've seen the impact on the ROI from these metrics. And it's not even, sometimes it's the ROI you can track, like the connections that are built, the relationships are there, the intellectual capacity and capital your organization and people have, right? And again, it's about establishing a baseline, looking at it more frequently as well. Right? To my point earlier, I've worked with organizations that are launching something, buying technology, but there's 2.5 years, so they're going to measure something like engagement. It's really hard to bring that together if we're not looking at that information more frequently. And again, I have a lot of stories on here, whether it's helping Rexall improve their ENPS or their engagement scores, or, I just talked about Arrowhead reducing their turnover. But again, having this information starts validating those expenses and easier to invest current state or more in the future. The people metrics, I won't spend too much time. We're pretty aware of that. The second, though, is really on the HR metrics, and what I call HR ROI, right? How does it impact your HR organization, your team? And the 2 that I typically see tell the best story are cost savings and HR efficiency. And cost savings are easy, right? We save from a previous vendor or doing what we were doing before. But it's not just the dollars we spend. It's what I mentioned earlier. It's activity costs of actually doing those things. And then there's HR efficiency. What's the time saved from being able to get support or programs or technology? What's the speed to execution? I talked about the survey example, right? You could wait 3 months to do all the analytics yourself, and then spend another month disseminating it out to other leaders, and then another 3 weeks having them create action plans, or technology can happen immediately. So what's the value of speed to action in some of those examples, or even just improved usage or sentiment from your employees? They're loving the new wellness initiative or the new recognition program or whatever you're running. And again, so many examples I have in terms of working with companies on saving budget or changing that administrative time. But the point I want to make here is that you should calculate the hours of admin work or efficiency and cost savings you would have based on how much hours you're spending on those efforts themselves. I work with so many organizations using the example we mentioned about collecting data, creating reports, sending it out, right? Or even on the recognition reward side, shipping out rewards to people or managing awards and nominations and spreadsheets. Again, if you actually take the amount of hours and time you're working on that, look at your rate from an hourly perspective, in many cases, that number is a reasonable number that can actually be supported from technology so people can focus on other high value things in the organization. So HR metrics and HR ROI is a very, very important second pillar. Now, the next part is, well, from a third perspective, it's about the company performance. And these aren't all the different metrics, right? I'm just using customer sat, performance, and profitability as an example. But it might be wellness, it might be efficiency, it might be cost saving. There's a lot of things that might happen from a company performance perspective. But do you have baselines on customer satisfaction? Can you identify correlations between your engagement or locations of your teams? I've worked with many organizations that will implement a program in some stores and not in other stores, and see customer sat scores that go up in the one that actually has those programs. So even trialing these things can give you that correlation that our investment in employee experience or technology in those places are actually proving to be successful, right? It's a lot easier to convince when you have the data that's there. Or the performance or productivity, right? Critical business results. Maybe it's safety, maybe it's production. But looking at the HR investment all the way down to the line of where the company defines success and you knowing what that scorecard is, it's so critical and important in that ROI story. Again, I've worked with many organizations, right? I talked about RBFCU and their increase in customer service scores. What's interesting from the research, 65% of orgs said investing in employee software improved the employee's productivity and performance. So in summary, if you're thinking of making the business case, right, to an investment you already made or an investment you are going to make, how do you start getting into, well, what's the people ROI, the HR ROI, and the company ROI in that narrative? Now, I'm not going to walk through the next slide, but I just wanted to share because I'm happy to share these slides later so you have it. It's very verbose. It's an eyesore. But the idea is when I'm trying to explain to an organization, well, what does this look like? I split it up in the exact same way that I shared with you. Company ROI, right? And what you're seeing here is just third-party data that has nothing to do with WorkTango. The bottom is just, data we have on our customers, but it's about, all right, cost saving, productivity, customer success, health and wellness. What are the people metrics and ROI there, right? Again, it's not just internal data, but third-party data on retention, engagement. HR, right? Team ROI, time and cost savings. So again, that's just a method, and I'll share this with you, but it's meant to bring it together and how you can actually use this template and potentially having this conversation in your organization. So that's the first practice. The second best practice, to see ROI, provide frequent, meaningful recognition to your employees. I don't know if you noticed in the data, recognition kept popping up as a thing and a strategy that was helping drive better employee experiences and all the outputs of that. What's interesting is let's take technology out of the equation, right? Let's look at what recognition was maybe 100 years ago when there was no technology, to the range and kind of the evolution of where it's gone. Is many companies are focusing on saying, well, how do I build a culture of recognition? And that culture has changed from milestones, right? Yes, it's important to take years of service that was invented in 1907 and recognize people's years of service and their milestones and things like that. It's shifted in many companies that are moving to what I call rhythm-based, right? Maybe it's awards or nominations, but a lot of those are top down. On the right, where companies are going and seeing the ROI is what I call always on recognition, right? You don't have to have rewards attached to it. Budget becomes a barrier of building a culture where values are amplified and behaviors are amplified on a regular basis. But the idea is technology allows this to happen. But this being an ROI talk, right? The point about peer-to-peer recognition, 35.7% more likely to have a positive impact on financial results versus manager only or top down. So as organizations are thinking about, well, I can just do this manually and manage it manually, it's really challenging to do without technology, which is why when companies start instituting those types of things, they start seeing the ROI numbers I shared earlier. Now, what's interesting is if I take this data a little further from the actual research, we asked folks, what's the frequency of employees receiving appreciation or recognition? And how does that correlate with company performance? It's a busy slide, but the light teal is where Q4 revenue improved, and the darker blue or purple is Q4 revenue declined. I want to highlight a few things here. One is that if organizations have that peer-to-peer recognition structure, people are getting recognized on a daily basis, there's a double the propensity to have higher revenue in the organization. That data is clear. If it's monthly, it's almost equal in terms of the propensity to have higher revenue improvements versus declines. But what you'll notice is if you're not doing it more than monthly, there's a high propensity to have declining revenue. And the big takeaway here is there's a distinct difference, right, and a higher propensity for revenue improvements when there's recognition at least on a monthly basis. So when you think about a lot of discussion today about, well, why are people seeing ROI from engagement or experience technologies, and recognition is just one that gets to the top of the list, it's because it's allowing this type of frequency. It's building out that admin side. It's carving out time for people to do other things versus admin. And a lot of the stuff just isn't manageable when it's done independently without technology to support it. Now, what's interesting is even this is outside of the research. This is research from my organization. When I look at every single employee using our platform from a recognition perspective, employees who use it actively stay at the company 2.8 years longer on average than inactive employees. So what you're seeing on the list there, those are the average employee tenure in tiers, whether they're focused on recognition on a more frequent basis, kind of a similar way of looking at the last chart, versus folks stay very, very rare. In fact, right, you're looking at, for people that don't get recognized on a frequent basis, it's 3.74 versus almost double when it's come to active or very active in recognition. And technology obviously enables a lot of that. So last thing I'll say on ROI and why recognition is a must-have is that I've seen a lot of companies shift to that mindset, right? Say it's not about doing it once a year or top down, but how do we try to build an always-on methodology that technology inspires? So that's the second best practice. Third best practice, how do we make it easy for employees to give and receive frequent feedback in their companies? I'm not going to go through this chart as detailed as I did on the recognition side, but we asked folks in the survey, are you maximizing the power of lifecycle surveys? And it's a similar question. How often do you focus on feedback or engagement surveys in your organization? There's a correlation between systems provide a positive ROI based on frequency versus a neutral ROI. And the call out on the right is where most of the data talks to. Positive ROI is 2 to 4 times higher when it's more frequent than annual. Right? Pretty telling when it comes to that. And a positive ROI surpasses neutral ROI when feedback cadence is monthly. And again, I've been in this business for a long time, and I see that correlation when companies are checking in more frequently versus once every 3 years or 2 years or even once a year. That's when they start seeing movement. Now, I'll talk about a little bit in a bit how this might seem challenging, like we can't do it more frequently, but that's because a lot of it's being done manually without the power of technology. But the reason why this works, so one of the best practices I want to share is that it's not just about frequency. It's not just about measuring things like engagement or your DE&I sentiment. It's about diagnostic feedback. When organizations get more frequent, and I'm talking about best practices and improving experience through surveys and listening, when you add diagnostic feedback such as, well, we just launched something, like what do people think about it? When we ask feedback, like we're about to do something for your organization, what information can you provide us to be able to help in those decisions? When you're not just measuring things like engagement, when you're asking them, we heard your sentiment, We have recommendations of what we should do differently. What do you think is going to improve your experience at work? That's when you get to what I call active listening, right? It's not just about frequency, which a lot of the data shows, but a best practice is trying to combine measurement and getting more times where you can measure, see the ROI of your investments you're making, as we talked about earlier, but pairing that with diagnostic feedback to see impact and results. And every time I bring up this topic, and I can't see you all, but if it's in person, people roll their eye and they're like, well, I can't do it more frequently. People aren't going to like that. What about survey fatigue? And I've been doing this for, almost 2 decades. There's no such thing as survey fatigue. There's lack of action fatigue, right? I've seen organizations, when they're leveraging technology, be able to listen and act in real time, right? Just like the example I was mentioning earlier, right? I've seen organizations change 4 months on average to get information from employees, get it to leaders, build action plans, and act, to literally less than 3 weeks. Right? Get the data, put in people's hands right away, and move the needle. And people will give you feedback if there's actions being taken or explanations on why action isn't being taken, which is also the case. So I bring up this example in terms of one of the best practices is it's important to build that culture of understanding and action by listen frequently, right? Not just engagement and measuring that, but think about the employee lifecycle. Maybe it's their onboarding experience. Maybe it's their experience of belonging. Maybe it's through change management. Maybe it's back to work. But if we're not listening to people, it's so hard for us to build and navigate towards a successful employee experience, which has all the ROI we just talked about. Also important to not just keep that data in HR. Give the insights to leaders that actually can do something with that information and have bigger impact. There's a lot of Canadians here, but one of the examples I just mentioned, Rexall doesn't use the platform to keep the data in HR, right? They actually take that data and put it into the hands of every store manager. They log in and see how their teams are doing. They can act on it in real time. But we shouldn't be a filter to important feedback. And the last part is obviously accountability, right? How does technology make that happen automatically when it comes to actions and learnings? Patrick, exactly, right? Conversation should be timely, frequent, and impactful, not annual. And I think it's funny, right? We came from the finance world, right? The world of HR. It kind of spun out from finance if you look at a lot of the history. And I think we just look at the world in finance, like annual statements and quarterly statements, annual reviews, annual surveys, right? How do we get out of that mindset to how our companies and our employees work every day, which is daily and monthly and weekly, not annually? So that's a third best practice. Last best practice I want to talk to before getting into discussion and questions is it's all about the mindset and the delivery that really matters if you want to get to this world. I've talked to a lot of organizations that maybe you're sitting there saying, listen, we don't even track ROI today, or we don't even invest in anything from a technology perspective. And that's okay. But when I ask folks to say, well, what got you to the place you are in now? What mindsets got you to that next step? I want to kind of solidify that and summarize that based on a lot of the conversations I've had. First part and first mindset is around using consumer principles. So I talked about being from the world of marketing, right? Really cool research from Gartner showed, look at all the technology and impact on your customer relationship systems that your organization or many organizations typically use. How do we engage our customers? How do we personalize the marketing to them? How do we listen to our customers to know what they're doing and thinking so we can build better experiences for them? How's a sentiment activity? What are the loyalty programs to make them coming back? How do we service and support our customers so they never leave us? But if we use that exact same concept for our talent, right? How do we engage the talent? How do we personalize things? We all know when something's not personalized, right? How do we personalize things to them? How do we reward and recognize them? How do we service and support our employees so they never leave? Conceptually, having that mindset's critical. Ask your organization when it comes to budget time, how much are we spending on our customer systems versus our talent systems? A lot of the data shows sometimes 10 to 12 times more. That can help you have that ROI conversation. And I'm just reading Patrick's comment, right? Success was not a focus of on a form. A form should support the conversation. Exactly, right? I'll take a diversion for a second on that comment, Patrick. But I always say there's two types of employee voice. There's sentiment. Well, how did you feel? But there's participative management. Well, what would you do differently? What should I do differently? What could the company do differently? It's kind of like a retrospective. What worked? What didn't? Like, what are we going to do differently? The data or the form gives you information and data to discuss. right? And have that relational approach. So appreciate the comments, Patrick. So mindset one is use consumer principles. The second mindset, and probably one of the most useful piece of feedback I ever got from a leader early in my career, was use the art of data. I'll never forget this. I had a leader back in the day said, Rob, use the art of data. I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, I didn't know what that meant. It's like, listen, if you don't use the art of data, you won't have a seat at the table. People won't listen to you. I was like, I still don't know what you're talking about. And he laid it out for me. He's like, Rob, the data that you have, and I'm talking about whether it's ROI or any of the other data you use in your profession. He said, use the art. And art is an acronym. A is for absolute, R is for relative, and T is for trend. And then it started to make sense, right? A, absolute. I can tell you that our engagement scores are 68. Okay. It's absolute. It has no value. It's not relatable to anything. So the R, which it has to be relative. So is 68% relative to other departments in our organization, other organizations in our company around the world, right? Other benchmarks to other companies in our industry. Without that relative part, that 68 is useless. Now you have some level of understanding of what 68 really means. And the T in the trend, in the art of data, is trend. Is 68 going up? Is it going up from 45? Or is it going down from 90? That's a very different value on what that 68 means. So if it's absolute, relative, and trend, now I can understand the data. So when it comes to trying to build an ROI conversation with your team or share the data that you have to prove that, use the art of data in that conversation. Again, it changed my perspective, and it's one of the best pieces of advice when it comes to sharing and having a data discussion. Last mindset I want to have kind of gets us back to the beginning, right? Remember inputs and outputs? This is the last piece of advice. If you're not familiar with what this is, it's called the service profit chain. It says if we have employees who do amazing things, right? What that's going to do is going to make customers love us and come back and refer us. And when that happens, we're going to have shareholder value or high profitability or however you define success of your business, right? On the output side. But what's really interesting about this, back to inputs and outputs, employees are the only inputs that we can control, right? Customer satisfaction are outputs. Shareholder value, revenue, profitability are outputs. You cannot change those, right? The only thing you influence are the inputs, what employees do every day, the products they build, the services they provide, you name it. So when we think about these investments, right, not cost, but investments into the employee experience by leveraging technology or other approaches, that's the right mindset to have, right? It's not a cost, it's an investment to make sure that we're giving the right experience where those people can succeed to make all these other metrics happen. And what do we often do, right? We think that the first thing we're going to start cutting is employee programs or employees or those types of things, which is the wrong mindset to have. So what I want to do and leave you with is this before any questions. So we remember the story from the beginning, the DuPont company. The last piece of advice and maybe mindset is be like Donald Sid Brown, right? Stand out, right? He was the guy wearing the suit. He was the guy talking about ROI back then when no one else was. But be the HR leader shepherding ROI and impact in your organization. Know what the real ROI metrics that drive the success of your company, not just your people and your HR team. Be the person understanding that information and sharing how your department, role, organization is impacting those type of metrics. And again, talk about the art of data and how it's influenced and start having those types of conversations because as unpredictable as the economic world is, how easier it is to get information with AI. I mean, the reality is that we need to be figuring out, well, how do we continue to have ROI as a mindset, but make sure we're doing the things that actually impact it, like investing in employee experience technology, which was a big part of today's conversation. So that being said, just first off, a thank you for everyone's attention. I love connecting with leaders. That's look at me up on LinkedIn. There's a QR code there as well. Happy to take some thoughts and questions. But yeah, really, really appreciate it. And Alex, hopefully I wasn't on mute and you heard me that whole time.
No, that was perfect, Rob. Thank you so much for that presentation. We got a couple questions from the audience here if you want to get into those. The
Do
first
it.
one that I'm seeing is from Patrick as well, and it says, "What is the size of companies, or what are the size of companies in the surveys? 100K investment in a company with 10 versus 100 EEs is a large difference in per EE investment."
Yeah. So, Patrick, I don't know the exact division of different types and sizes. They were across the board. There were companies that were 100 employees all the way up to 10,000 plus in terms of the way that they were filtered out when people filled out the survey. Um, on that one slide, which was really verbose around the three different points, I tried to get to, there was a scale part of it where companies investing 100K, as an example, saw a huge impact. I think 81% had at least 100K of ROI. But earlier on, there were companies investing 10K that did see impact as well, right? And that gets back to smaller organizations. So it's a great question because I think it reinforces that depending on the size of your company, you can only invest so much. But regardless of how large you are and how much the investment is, there is a higher propensity to see ROI based on those types of investments.
Beautiful. Awesome. Thank you, Rob. I got another one here. It
Oh,
says,
last thing I'll say is the data is going to come out and the research is going to come out next week, like I mentioned, and that'll all be in there. So, so you'll be able to see more specifically, like exactly what percentage were this side, this industry, and so on.
beautiful. Awesome. Thank you. Another one here that says, any advice on how to approach ROI metrics in general?
Ooh, okay. Well, I think that what I mentioned a lot, I'll maybe reinforce a lot of the things I just mentioned. First off, you have to have the metric, right? There's a lot of organizations that just, I'm surprised when I meet them. It's like, listen, we're not really measuring engagement, or our last survey was 2018. And it's really hard to be able to show impact unless you have the data there. And what are we told as HR leaders? Be data driven, be data driven. If you get blocked by your executive team, maybe one piece of advice to say, listen, I can't share with you the impact of my actions unless I can measure engagement or get this type of data or have access to the KPI dashboard of the whole executive team that I'm not privy to, or whatever those things are. So I think entering yourself into the conversation is one thing, but I always say HR leaders need data too, right? Like just like sales leaders need data and finance people need data, like at the end of the day, you need data too. And that's just maybe one above and beyond all the other things I said in terms of speaking the art of data and understanding the language, et cetera, in terms of just a general view in terms of where to start.
Couldn't agree more. That's perfect. Thank you so much. I got another one here. It says, someone says they're surprised to see performance management as an ROI driver. Any reason why you think that's so?
Yeah, I was going to add a bunch of slides on this and I didn't. But the way it was defined in the survey was other things within performance management. So, checking in with your employees, having frequent conversations, those type of things. It wasn't just the appraisal process that goes into it and rate people 1 out of 3. What's interesting is actually what I was going to share was effectively a matrix that showed there are a lot of things you can do to improve the employee experience, right? A lot of things we just talked about, performance management being one of them. If you actually look at the heart of those things, of what actually drives a better employee experience versus a better company experience, like performance management is really good to track goals and build accountability, but it's usually a company focused feature versus an employee experience feature, something like listening or recognition. That being said, though, performance management, as broad as it is, has a lot of things. As I mentioned, it's checking in. It's not only goals and appraisals, but it's all the other things that you might have in terms of conversations. And it was mentioned there, like how do you have conversations and relational approaches? So even when you're investing, making sure that technology or efforts or time are focused on some of those employee experience type initiatives versus company experience and focus initiatives is kind of the a good way to think about it, but it did have a little more meaning. I'm trying to get rid of the whole word performance management. I want to call it performance development, where it's about development, not managing people or compensation or all the other stuff. But hopefully that helps, Alex.
Yeah, no, that was perfect. I like that. Looks like we got one last one here. It says, what if I can't get the ear of execs to listen to my ROI discussions? Are there any other ways to get their buy-in?
Yeah. Um, I think I answered it with the first question a bit when it comes to, tell them you need the data to make those type of decisions, right? Another thing I like to do is use third-party data, right? Like, how do we share that listen, there is data out there that not doesn't just say that if I do something, whether it's invest or in a program or a strategy, it's going to improve the HR metrics. It's going to improve the company metrics. And I might not have the data with you here, but I have other benchmark data or other information out there in the wild to help support that. Um, Other thing is if there isn't find one champion on that team that can support you and understands it. And I think the last resort is if your executive team does not want to focus on your employee experience, maybe it's time to find another executive team.
Right on. I couldn't agree more. That's awesome. Well, unfortunately, we have reached our time for today, but Rob, I just wanted to once again extend a thank you for being here today and giving that amazing presentation. I know I learned a lot. Also, a huge thank you to our sponsor, WorkTango. Last but not least, I just want to thank you, the audience, for your questions and participation. Thanks again, Rob, and I hope everyone has a great and safe day.
Take care, everyone.